A conference room in Manhattan. A venture capital pitch meeting where startup founders compete for millions in funding. Maria Gonzalez, a Mexican immigrant who came to America 12 years ago with $200 and a dream, stands at the front of the room presenting her sustainable fashion company. Before she can finish explaining her business model, Richard Ashford, a billionaire CEO whose family wealth goes back 4 generations, interrupts her with a condescending smirk and says, "Sweetheart, maybe you should go back to making my clothes instead of trying to sell them." The room goes silent. Some investors look uncomfortable. Others suppress laughter. Maria pauses, looks Richard directly in the eyes, and responds with 6 words that will change both their lives. "I'll remember you said that." What happened 18 months later didn't just humble one arrogant CEO. It became a case study taught in business schools about resilience, strategic thinking, and why underestimating people based on their background is always a catastrophic mistake. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Maria Gonzalez is now worth more than Richard Ashford, and how one moment of casual cruelty became the motivation for one of the most spectacular business comebacks in recent history. Let me take you back to understand who Maria Gonzalez was before that humiliating pitch meeting, because her journey to that Manhattan conference room is a story of determination that makes what happened afterward even more remarkable. Maria was born in Guadalajara, Mexico, in a working-class neighborhood where her mother worked as a seamstress and her father did construction work. From age 7, Maria would sit beside her mother's sewing machine after school, learning stitching patterns and fabric selection while other kids played outside. Her mother, Rosa, had dreams of opening her own boutique, but never had the capital or opportunity. Rosa would tell Maria that talent and hard work weren't enough in a world structured to keep certain people in their place. You also needed courage to demand what you deserved and strategy to outmaneuver those who try to stop you. Maria absorbed those lessons alongside the technical skills, not knowing how crucial they'd become. At 19, Maria came to the United States on a student visa to study business at a community college in Los Angeles. She worked 3 jobs to pay tuition, waitressing at a Mexican restaurant, cleaning houses, and doing alterations at a dry cleaner. She slept 4 hours a night and studied in between shifts, driven by her mother's unfulfilled dreams and her own determination to build something significant. After earning her associate degree, Maria transferred to UCLA on a partial scholarship, graduating with honors in business administration while continuing to work full-time. But here's what the statistics about immigrant success stories often miss. Maria faced discrimination at every stage. Professors who assumed she'd plagiarized papers because they couldn't believe someone with her accent could write so well. Employers who wouldn't interview her because her name sounded too ethnic. Customers at her waitressing job who'd mockingly ask if she was legal while leaving insultingly small tips. Each incident was a small cut, and over years, those cuts accumulated into scars that shaped how Maria saw her place in American society. After graduating, Maria started her company, Renacimiento Fashion, from her studio apartment using skills her mother had taught her and $5,000 she'd saved over 2 years. Her business model was revolutionary in its simplicity: sustainable fashion made by immigrant women who were paid fair wages and given pathways to ownership in the company. Maria had identified a gap in the market. Consumers, especially younger millennials and Gen Z, increasingly wanted ethically made clothing, but most sustainable fashion companies were startups run by wealthy white founders who treated ethics as marketing rather than genuine commitment. Maria's competitive advantage was authenticity. The women sewing her clothes weren't exploited workers in distant factories. They were co-owners building equity in a company that valued their contributions. The clothes themselves were high quality, stylish, and priced competitively with fast fashion brands that relied on exploitation to keep costs low. Renacimiento grew steadily through word of mouth and social media, reaching $2 million in annual revenue by year 3. Maria reinvested every profit back into the company, expanding her team of seamstresses, improving her supply chain, and developing her brand identity. She was approached by several small investors, but turned them down because they wanted control and wanted to change her business model in ways that would undermine the ethical foundation she'd built. Maria knew she needed capital to scale, to open retail locations, invest in marketing, and compete with established fashion brands. but she refused to compromise her vision for money. That's what brought her to that Manhattan venture capital pitch meeting, where some of the country's wealthiest investors gathered monthly to evaluate startup opportunities. Maria had been invited to pitch by a junior partner who discovered her company and believed it had massive potential. What that junior partner hadn't warned Maria about was Richard Ashford. Richard Ashford was exactly the kind of person that America's economic system was designed to protect and reward. His great-grandfather had made a fortune in textile manufacturing during the early 1900s using sweatshop labor, and each generation had grown that wealth through investments that never risked the family fortune but captured returns from others' innovations. Richard himself ran Ashford Industries, a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring struggling fashion brands, cutting costs ruthlessly, usually by moving production to countries with minimal labor protections, and then selling the companies for profit. He'd made hundreds of millions using this formula, and he'd developed the particular arrogance that comes from never having faced real consequences for being wrong or cruel. Richard saw the world as divided into winners like himself and losers who'd failed to inherit or marry into wealth, and he treated those losers with casual contempt that people in his circle accepted as normal. When Maria walked into that conference room to pitch, Richard sized her up instantly and made assumptions based on every bias he carried. He saw a Latina woman with a slight accent, wearing clothes she'd obviously made herself, presenting a business about ethical fashion, which Richard dismissed as a niche market for naive consumers who didn't understand that profit required exploitation. He didn't listen to her financial projections showing 40% year-over-year growth. He didn't care that her customer retention rate was 92% or that her social media engagement dwarfed established brands, spending millions on marketing. He'd already decided she wasn't worth his time, and he was personally annoyed that this woman he considered beneath him had been given a platform in his presence. So when Maria was mid-sentence explaining her supply chain advantages, Richard interrupted with that devastating comment. "Sweetheart, maybe you should go back to making my clothes instead of trying to sell them." The words hung in the air like poison. Several things were happening simultaneously in that moment. Richard was making a racist assumption that Maria belonged in a factory serving people like him rather than sitting at the table as an equal. He was using a diminutive term, sweetheart, that reduced her from professional to object. He was dismissing years of work and achievement because they didn't match his preconceptions about who deserved success. And he was doing all of this publicly, in front of other investors, essentially inviting them to join his mockery or at minimum to accept his judgment that Maria wasn't worthy of investment. Most devastating was that several investors in the room did laugh, while others stayed silent, which was its own form of complicity. Only two people objected: the junior partner who'd invited Maria and one female investor who'd built her own company and recognized the dynamics at play. Maria stood at the front of that room, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that anyone who's been systematically underestimated will recognize. Part of her wanted to lash out, to tell Richard exactly what she thought of him and his inherited mediocrity. Part of her wanted to leave immediately, to preserve her dignity by refusing to beg for money from people who'd never respect her. But another part, the part shaped by her mother's lessons about strategy and her own years of fighting for everything she'd achieved, calculated coldly. Getting angry would confirm Richard's biases. Walking out would give him the satisfaction of having driven her away. But responding with that simple promise, "I'll remember you said that," communicated something more dangerous to someone like Richard if he'd been smart enough to hear it. "I'm not giving up. I'm not going to forget this, and someday you're going to regret underestimating me." Maria finished her pitch to hostile silence, thanked the investors for their time with more grace than they deserved, and left that conference room with zero funding and crystal-clear motivation. What happened over the next 18 months was a masterclass in turning humiliation into fuel and resentment into strategy. Maria could have let Richard's contempt break her spirit. Many entrepreneurs would have internalized that rejection, questioned their worth, maybe even abandoned their dreams. Instead, Maria made a decision that night. She would build Renacimiento into such an undeniable success that people like Richard Ashford would be forced to acknowledge what they'd missed. More than that, she'd do it in a way that proved her model: ethical treatment of workers, sustainable practices, authentic values. Wasn't just morally superior, but financially superior to the exploitative practices that people like Richard relied on. The rejection became a challenge, and Maria had never backed down from a challenge in her life. Maria went back to growing her company organically, but now with a specific competitive target in mind. She researched Ashford Industries and discovered that Richard's private equity firm owned several fashion brands that competed in similar markets to Renacimiento. These brands relied on cheap overseas labor, had regular scandals about working conditions, and were increasingly facing consumer backlash from ethically conscious shoppers. Maria saw an opportunity. She started targeting the exact customers that Ashford's brands were losing: young consumers who wanted fashionable clothes but felt guilty about supporting exploitation. She told her story openly, including the pitch meeting humiliation, and her transparency resonated. Social media embraced her narrative. The immigrant woman building an ethical company in the face of rejection by wealthy elites who'd rather profit from exploitation. That Renacimiento's growth accelerated dramatically. Revenue jumped from $2 million to $8 million in year 4, then to $26 million in year 5. Maria secured funding from impact investors who were excited about her model, giving her capital to expand without compromising her values. She opened retail locations in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Austin. She launched an e-commerce platform that became one of the fastest-growing fashion sites in the country. And most importantly, she maintained the ethical foundation that made her brand authentic. Her seamstresses were still co-owners, still paid fair wages, still treated as valued partners rather than expendable labor. Every success felt sweeter knowing that Richard Ashford had dismissed all of this as impossible. But Maria wasn't content with just building a successful competitor. She wanted something more definitive, more symbolic. She wanted to beat Richard at his own game in a way he couldn't dismiss or ignore. That opportunity came when Maria learned that one of Ashford Industries' brands, a mid-tier fashion company called Classic that Richard had acquired 5 years earlier, was struggling. Richard's usual playbook of cost-cutting and exploitation had backfired. Consumers were boycotting the brand after investigative journalists exposed horrific conditions in their factories. Sales were plummeting, and Classic was on track to become a costly failure for Ashford Industries. For most investors, this would have been a company to avoid: damaged brand, toxic reputation, declining revenue. But Maria saw something different. She saw an opportunity to acquire a company with established distribution networks and retail relationships, rebrand it with ethical practices, and demonstrate that her model could rescue exactly the kind of company that Richard's approach had destroyed. Maria began quietly assembling the financial backing to acquire Classic. She pitched impact investors and ethical funds, showing them how the company could be transformed under her leadership. She developed a detailed plan for transitioning Classic's supply chain to the fair wage, worker ownership model that had made Renacimiento successful. And critically, she negotiated partnerships with the workers in Classic's existing factories, promising them equity and better conditions if the acquisition succeeded. Within 6 months, Maria had secured commitments for $80 million in acquisition funding, more than enough to buy Classic outright. She made her offer to Ashford Industries, and here's where the story gets really satisfying. Richard Ashford had to decide whether to accept an offer from the woman he'd publicly humiliated. Richard's initial reaction was to reject the offer purely out of spite. According to people familiar with the negotiations, he told his staff that he'd rather shut Classic down than sell it to Maria. But Richard wasn't the sole decision-maker. Ashford Industries had other investors and board members who cared more about recouping losses than about Richard's ego. Maria's offer was fair market value for a struggling brand, and turning it down would have been financially irresponsible. The board overruled Richard, and the sale went through. Maria Gonzalez acquired Classic in a deal that made business headlines and captured public imagination. The immigrant entrepreneur who'd been mocked in a pitch meeting had just bought a company from the billionaire who'd mocked her. But Maria's revenge wasn't just about the acquisition. It was about what she did next. She invited Richard to a press conference announcing the purchase and the transformation plan for Classic. Richard, backed into a corner by his board and unable to avoid the public embarrassment, attended. Maria stood at the podium, flanked by some of the workers from Classic's factories who would become co-owners under her plan, and she delivered remarks that were professional, gracious, and devastatingly pointed. She thanked Ashford Industries for the opportunity to acquire Moda Classic. She acknowledged the company had faced challenges under previous management, but expressed confidence that ethical practices and worker empowerment would restore its success. And then, looking directly at Richard, she said, 18 months ago, someone told me I should go back to making clothes instead of trying to sell them. Today, I want to say thank you for that comment. It reminded me that the doubters and the gatekeepers don't get to decide what's possible. We decide that ourselves. The room erupted in applause. Richard's face went through a visible transformation. Shock, anger, humiliation, all flickering across features that were accustomed to control. He left without speaking to media, and the contrast couldn't have been sharper. Maria surrounded by workers and reporters, celebrating a victory built on ethics and hard work, while Richard slunk away having been outmaneuvered by someone he'd dismissed as beneath him. The story went viral instantly, shared millions of times across social media platforms, and Maria became a symbol of immigrant success and poetic justice. Think pieces were written about the incident in business journals, feminist publications, and social justice media. The consensus was universal. Richard Ashford had gotten exactly what he deserved, and Maria Gonzalez had delivered one of the most satisfying business comebacks in recent memory. The transformation of Moda Classic under Maria's ownership proved that her business model wasn't just morally superior, but financially superior. Within a year, the rebranded company, now called Moda Classic by Renacimiento, had restored profitability by attracting ethically conscious consumers who'd boycotted the brand under Ashford's ownership. The workers, now co-owners, were more productive and committed than they'd been as exploited labor. The brand's reputation recovered as investigative journalists documented the improved conditions and fair wages. Maria's total fashion empire, Renacimiento plus the acquired Moda Classic, was now generating over $100 million in annual revenue, and Maria's personal net worth was estimated at $45 million. She'd gone from being rejected by Richard Ashford to being wealthier than some of the investors who'd laughed at her in that pitch meeting. Richard Ashford's story after this incident became a cautionary tale about the limits of inherited wealth and the dangers of arrogance. Ashford Industries continued operating, but Richard's reputation was damaged. He became known as the billionaire who'd been outplayed by the woman he'd mocked, and that story followed him in business circles where reputation matters. Some investors became more cautious about backing his acquisitions. Media covering fashion and business frequently referenced the Moda Classic incident when discussing Richard, always unfavorably. He'd thought his wealth and position made him untouchable, but Maria had proven that competence and strategy could defeat privilege and condescension. Richard never publicly acknowledged his mistake or apologized, which only made him look worse. His silence was interpreted as inability to accept that he'd been wrong about Maria and wrong about which business model would succeed. The broader impact of Maria's story extended far beyond personal vindication. She became one of the most visible examples of immigrant entrepreneurship success, and she used that platform intentionally. Maria spoke at universities, business conferences, and community organizations, always emphasizing that her success wasn't about individual exceptionalism, but about what becomes possible when people are given fair opportunities and when ethical business practices are valued over pure profit extraction. She advocated for immigration reform, for protections for garment workers, for investment in businesses owned by women and people of color. She established a venture fund specifically to support immigrant entrepreneurs who faced the same barriers she'd encountered. And she hired the junior partner who'd originally invited her to that disastrous pitch meeting, bringing him to Renacimiento as chief strategy officer in recognition of his willingness to support her when others hadn't. Maria's mother, Rosa, who'd never achieved her dream of owning a boutique in Mexico, became a co-owner and advisor for Renacimiento. Maria brought her to the United States and gave her significant role in the company, acknowledging that everything Maria had accomplished was built on foundations Rosa had laid. In interviews, Maria would often say that her success wasn't hers alone. It belonged to her mother who'd taught her skills and values, to the seamstresses who'd built the company alongside her, and to every immigrant who'd come to America hoping their work would be valued fairly. This perspective, that success was communal rather than individual, stood in stark contrast to the Richard Ashfords of the world who saw their wealth as personal achievement rather than inherited privilege and systemic advantage. The story of Maria's confrontation with Richard also sparked important conversations about bias in venture capital and startup funding. Studies have consistently shown that women receive only about 2% of venture capital funding despite founding companies at increasing rates, and that founders of color face even worse disparities. Maria's experience of being dismissed and mocked in a pitch meeting wasn't unusual. It was the norm for many entrepreneurs who didn't fit the narrow demographic profile that investors expected. What was unusual was that Maria had succeeded despite the rejection and had done so spectacularly enough that her story became national news. Her success prompted some investors to examine their own biases and consider how many profitable companies they'd missed funding because they couldn't see past a founder's accent, gender, or ethnic background. 5 years after that humiliating pitch meeting, Maria Gonzalez was worth over $150 million and had built a fashion empire that employed thousands of people while maintaining ethical practices that the industry had claimed were impossible at scale. Richard Ashford was still wealthy. Inherited money is hard to lose completely, but his reputation never recovered, and several of his private equity investments had failed in ways that suggested his golden touch had been more luck and exploitation than actual business acumen. Maria could have focused on that vindication, could have spent her time savoring Richard's downfall. Instead, she focused on building, on creating opportunities for others, on proving that business success and ethical treatment of people weren't contradictory goals. If you take one lesson from Maria Gonzalez's story, let it be this: other people's limitations are not your ceiling. When Richard Ashford told Maria she should go back to making clothes instead of selling them, he was revealing his own limitations, his inability to see past stereotypes, his assumption that the system would always protect people like him from people like her. Maria refused to accept those limitations as her own. She took the humiliation and transformed it into motivation, took the rejection and used it to clarify her competitive advantage, and took Richard's contempt and returned it as a masterclass in strategic business thinking. Her story proves that underestimating people is always a mistake, and that the barriers systems create to keep certain people out can become advantages when those people refuse to accept their assigned place. Here's what you can do right now. First, if you're an entrepreneur or have a dream you're pursuing, stop waiting for permission from gatekeepers who may never see your value. Maria didn't need Richard Ashford's money or approval. She needed her own determination and the support of people who understood her vision. Second, examine your own biases about who can succeed and what success looks like. When you hear an accent or see someone whose background doesn't match traditional entrepreneur profiles, check your assumptions. Third, support businesses that treat workers ethically and that are built on values rather than pure profit extraction. Every purchase is a vote for the kind of economy you want to see. And finally, remember that the people who dismiss you often reveal more about themselves than about you. If Maria's story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to accept limitations that others tried to impose on them. Share this with any entrepreneur or dreamer in your life who needs to know that rejection isn't the end. It's often just the beginning. Drop a comment telling us about times you've been underestimated and how you prove the doubters wrong. Or share your thoughts on how we create systems where people like Maria don't have to fight so hard just to be taken seriously. Because Maria Gonzalez's triumph over Richard Ashford's contempt proves that the arc of justice doesn't bend on its own. It bends when people refuse to be broken by those who underestimate them.